We're going to be in chapter 9. You may remember we have been going through the book of Genesis. We took a break as we went through the Christmas season and considered what God had provided for us in Jesus Christ, that indeed God is for us. God loves us. Everything that we need, God has given in Jesus Christ to be right with Him. Well, we now return to the first book of the Bible, which is also the first book of the Old Testament and also the first book of what is called the Book of Moses or the Torah. And here we are able to learn about the beginning, as well as God's blessing of redemption on sinful people. And this morning we're going to take a look at what Moses writes for us at the end of chapter 9 in Genesis. And so I'm going to read aloud in Genesis chapter 9, starting in verse 18, and we'll read through the end of Genesis 9. Now the sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And Ham was the father of Canaan. These three were the sons of Noah, and from these the whole earth was scattered abroad. Then Noah began to be a man of the land and planted a vineyard. And he drank of the wine and became drunk and uncovered himself inside his tent. Then Ham, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. But Shem and Japheth took the garment and laid it upon both their shoulders and walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were turned backward so that they did not see their father's nakedness. Then Noah awoke from his wine, and he knew what his youngest son had done to him. So he said, "Cursed be Canaan, a servant of servants he shall be to his brothers." And he said, "Blessed be Yahweh, the God of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant. May God enlarge Japheth, and let him dwell in the tents of Shem, and let Canaan be his servant." And Noah lived 350 years after the flood. So all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. Well, this is clearly one of those passages that you have to be committed to what's called sequential exposition to preach. If you wanted to skip over a passage, this might be one of those passages that you skip over. If you want to send an email to your church families to say, you may not want to bring your children to church, this might be one of those Sundays. So parents, you're going to have to do the best you can do with trying to explain some of the details that I may not be as explicit as one could be. This is a passage that is very significant. Strange as it is to us, it is set before us after God makes a covenant with Noah and all creation after the world and humanity has been destroyed with a flood. And so chapter 9, you may remember, set forth that covenant, and the sign of that covenant was the bow, the rainbow that God set in the clouds. We're going to see that, like Moses, Noah exits the ark, builds an altar, offers sacrifice, just as after the exodus of slavery to Egypt, one of the things that Moses does is he builds an altar and he offers sacrifice, and there is peace between God and his people. And a covenant relationship has been made there. And every time we come to the end of one of these covenant relationships that follows some kind of divine act of judgment that saves God's people, we have in one sense a pregnant question. A question that is pregnant in our minds as readers of the Old Testament, the Torah, the book of Genesis starting, is we know what was in the garden before the fall. And we know what happened because of Adam's fall, his sin, exile from God's presence, no longer living at peace within the marriage and family relationship, no longer being at peace with the land and its blessing. We are waiting, in one sense, for one to come from woman who will defeat the serpent. And so when we come to Genesis, the end of Genesis chapter 9, verse 17, and we were told that God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant which I have established between me and all flesh that is on the earth." Kind of the pregnant expectation that we're now wondering is, are now things going to be different? And what this passage does that Moses explains, strange as it may be to us, that this passage, in one sense, makes sense of our world by connecting us and the nations to how things were divided from Noah's three sons. And at the same time, it connects Noah and his sons back with the garden. This passage enables us to understand our world that consists of many different types of, you could say, kinds of Adam's descendants. We learn about the genesis of the nations. And in one sense, it's made explicit for us. Look at verses 18 and 19. This is, in one sense, kind of the explanation statement of this particular narrative. Now the three sons of Noah who went out of the ark were Shem and Ham and Japheth, and Ham was the father of Canaan. Now, obviously, one of those sons is being accented as really important for us to be able to recognize. Why do we need to know about Ham? Why do we need to know of this particular event and its details? Because Ham is the father of Canaan. For many of us, when we get to other sections that will follow in the Old Testament, and we hear of God's covenant promises to Abraham's descendants, even God's covenant promise to Abraham that he is going to be given a land, we begin to wonder, like, why is that right of God to do? Why does God promise to Abraham and to his descendants this land? And why do the people of that land, why are they not able to dwell in that land, but in fact they are to yield and to bless Abraham's seed and give them the land? Well, one of the things that we are taught in the book of Genesis is that those people and that land, they are descendants from Ham. And now we learn about their father. And we learn about their ways. And they are going to be contrasted with the other two sons of Noah. And verse 19 then tells us, it's from these three sons that the whole earth was scattered abroad. So I don't know your people. I don't know where your people are from. Obviously, we're not going to send out, there's no need of any kind of like heritage tests or whatever you can find out. But this is what the Bible teaches me about every single one of us, is that all of us find our lineage, and you could even say genetics, from Noah. All of us in that sense would be able to say we are all sons of Noah, in the same way that we all are able to say we are all sons of Adam. And in this sense, we're able to make a few different observations about the present world because of this particular passage and its narrative. And that is, verse 19 teaches us there is no such thing as human races. There is only an Adamic race, or we could even say now a Noetic race. And so whatever your skin color happens to be, which is to say whatever degree of melanin God has so decreed that your skin have, whatever the texture of your hair may be. And we could go on to be able to describe outwardly the visual manifestations of what you look like and what I look like. You need to be able to do this, Christian. You need to be able to say, well, really all you are is just another son of Noah. And all I am is another son of Noah. And it might be better for us to call these peoples or nations or ethnicities and not to call them races. Verse 19 makes that clear. And we're able to understand this because of the way in which Scripture unfolds for us God's work of redemption in human history. But there's more to the story. The details that follow from verse 20 to 29 require us to understand more about our present division and dispersal among the earth. We need to know more about someone than my nose is this big and this shaped, my hair or lack thereof or thinning. All right. We need to know more than the kind of preoccupation that secular unregenerate people have with their ethnic distinctives. We need to know what separated Ham from his two brothers. And here's the fundamental issue. How did they deal with sin? What is going to divide the peoples, both the peoples as in Noah's three sons, and what is going to divide the peoples that are cast throughout the world today is how do they respond to sin? Now we look at what is, in one sense, maybe to us a strange story. Maybe to some of us, you're like, that doesn't sound strange at all. That sounds like my house. That sounds like the father I had. All right, so that might be true for some of us, but it is definitely true for Noah. And so we're going to go through this particular section, and I'm going to make in one sense, the points of the sermon are just going to be kind of like narrative placeholders. And what we first are able to see is Noah is like Adam. First, we're able to see Noah's like Adam because he gardens like Adam. When you look at verse 20, Moses writes that Noah began to be a man of the land. Your translation may say he began to be a farmer. Now, I really appreciate the way this is a legacy standard, the way it renders this, because the land is a very important phrase already in Genesis. See, the land of Genesis chapter 2 was the garden. And there you may remember that God placed the man in that particular land, and he gave him an order that he is to tend and keep. So this is not accidental. This is a clear description after the flood. In one sense, Noah, the new Adam, now in the new creation, you might even say the new garden, what does Noah take up? He takes up, in one sense, the same kind of life that Adam took up. And so we are pregnant with the very first clause of verse 20. Maybe things will be different. Noah began to be a man of the land, and he planted a vineyard. The description in Genesis 2 of what God did in Eden is God planted a garden. So we are able to see, just like God made Adam to be his image bearer, and there was, in one sense, both a reflection and a commission of God's authority in Adam ruling the land. So we were able to see now in Noah, in one sense, functioning like a new Adam in a new garden, having that same reflection that now, like God, he plants a vineyard. Noah is like Adam. He gardens like Adam gardened. And it's true. In one sense, we could say a gardener's going to garden. You can ask Teresa. It's just in them. It's going to happen. You can't suppress it. And so that's indeed what Noah begins to do, and he plants a vineyard. And vineyards are going to do what vineyards do. And so, from all of the craft and effort and skill of Noah's gardening the land, the vineyard produces grapes, and grapes are going to do what grapes can do, which mean they make wine. So, Noah, in one sense, you're already able to see this is the creation mandate restarted. The land is now giving forth the blessing of God. There's fruitfulness that is coming from the land after the flood in this now Noetic covenant, you might could call it. But we do remember back the Garden of Eden with all of its blessings, with all of the fruits that were given by God graciously to Adam. What did Adam do with those fruits? Did he use them for the glory of God and the good of man? Or did he use them sinfully, selfishly, lawlessly? See, Noah is also going to become like Adam because he uses the fruit, which is in one sense to say the blessing of God, like Adam, sinfully. And so when we look at verse 21, we see that Noah drank of the wine and became drunk and uncovered himself inside his tent. See, Noah, the new Adam in this new garden-like world with these new blessings of God and this renewed covenant, he now takes up the old ways that brought the race and the land to ruin again. He becomes like Adam in how he uses the fruit, the blessing of God in this land. Though God had purified the land and in one sense had purified humanity through the flood and starts over afresh with Noah because Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Noah then, like Adam, uses the blessing of God for sin and not service. And Noah takes the blessing of God from the vineyard so that the grapes, they become wine. And it is not used as a blessing from God, but as an instrument for sin. And as Adam ate the fruit forbidden by God for his selfish ends, so Noah drinks his wine with the selfish purposes of intoxication. See, this is how we learn that Noah fails, just like Adam fails. The result that indicates that Noah's drinking was sinful is because what was the result of Noah's drinking to the point of intoxication? He uncovered himself inside his tent, verse 21. Now, in this sense, we also see how Noah is like Adam. What did Adam find himself? What were the results of Adam's sinful consumption of God's fruit of the garden? He was naked. And he knew he needed to cover himself. The result of Noah's sin is that Noah actually uncovers himself. Now, it's at this point that we need to first note what is taught here. Verse 20 describes Noah in the way that he was like Adam before the fall, and verse 21 describes Noah as he was like Adam after the fall. He sinned against God. He used God's blessing from the land for lawlessness and finds himself naked, uncovered before God and man. Now, we now have to address two things. These are not primarily the point of the passage. These are actually assumed by Moses in the passage. We're going to need to talk about drunkenness, and we're going to need to talk about nakedness. So parents, you'll have to clean up things if it's not fitting for your children's understanding. But I'll do the best I can to thread this needle the appropriate way. First, while this passage is not a lesson on drunkenness, it clearly does provide a portrait of what Proverbs chapter 20, verse 1 states explicitly, and that is, wine is a mocker, strong drink a brawler, and whoever is led astray by it is not wise. And so we could say, Exhibit A, Noah, naked, passed out in his tent. But we do need to clarify how Noah's sin is manifested in his drunkenness and not necessarily in the fact that God blessed Noah in the land with the vineyard and grapes, which led to wine. Noah's sin is not the fruit of the land, which in our day and age, you need to make sure you're able to say this. Noah's sin is not because he possessed the land. Right? So any communists that are trying to sort of somehow make communism and Christianity work together, no bueno. Oil and water, they don't mix. There's no problem, there's no sin in Noah possessing the land. God gave it to him. There's no sin in Noah using the land for cultivation. All right, so environmentalists who are wanting to say it's not good that Noah actually took the land and he cultivated so that it would bring a harvest and bounty that is good for man. Nope, no bueno there either. The land is given to man for man to cultivate for man's blessing. Noah is doing that. It's also not Noah's sin that he actually takes the fruit of that vine and he uses it for the purposes and blessings and products that it can provide, which include wine. Now, I know that's going to be a difficult point for some of you to be able to say, but it is what is written in the text. The process of fermentation is a process that God designed. Grape juice can be preserved for people who lack refrigeration because of fermentation. God was pleased that that would be the case. So there's nothing wrong with the fact that Noah used the grapes from the vineyard made from the land for wine. There's actually nothing even wrong with Noah drinking it. We might need to say Jesus turned water into wine at a wedding. Jesus commissioned his disciples to remember him by drinking wine. We worship the Lord Jesus even when we ourselves remember him as a church, and if we so choose, do so when we drink wine. We choose grape juice here at our church, but there'd be no law for choosing wine. None of that is Noah's sin. See, Noah's sin is he actually used the fruit, the blessing of God from the vineyard which he planted in the land that God now had remade through the flood in this new, in one sense, restated covenant of that which was said in the garden. He did it for lawless purposes. He got drunk. Drunkenness was Noah's sin. Drunkenness is lawlessness or debauchery. It is having lacking self-control. And when you think about self-control, means a refusal to live in submission to God's standards. A lack of self-control, in one sense, is saying, I am going to do what I want, how I want. That's how Noah went about the using the fruit of the vine. That's exactly the same spirit that Satan tempted Eve and then Adam chose to do when he ate of the forbidden fruit. God says that when you eat of this, you will surely die. But Satan shows that no, you will not die. You will be like God. And so what does Adam do? He casts off submission to God, faith in God's good word, and he decides, I will do what I want, how I want, and God will not restrain me. Drunkenness is the same thing with the use of alcohol. That's Noah's sin. Drunkenness is the lack of self-control in the lawful use of God's gift. It is necessary that we are able to articulate that when we use sinfully God's blessings given to us in this present life, we are living lawlessly. We are lacking self-control. We are refusing subordination to God. And so what God gives to us for his good purposes and ends in our life. And when we refuse to yield to those, we are living in rebellion against God. That's exactly what took place in the garden. And now that's what's taking place in the new world with this new Adam. Noah does not live in submission to God's will, but rather pursues his selfish end without regard for God's desire, and so he gets drunk. Drunkenness was Noah's sin, and drunkenness today is still sin. Let's make sure that's very clear, Berean Community Church. Drunkenness is sin. That includes if you get drunk with alcohol, and that includes if you get high with weed. Any substance that we might use to live in violation of God's purposes is transgression. In Noah's time, it clearly was wine. In our day, you can be drunk on all manner of substances, but whether it's weed or wine, it is a sin to be drunk. And it will be, indeed, your mocker. Now, don't ask us stories, because many of us could unfortunately tell our own version of Genesis chapter 9, verse 21. But we do need to make very clear Noah's sin was drunkenness, and it remains a sin today. But the point of the passage is not to show us a parable about not being drunk. The point is what follows. But what's very important is that we have to see that Noah, like Adam, sinfully used the fruit, and he, like Adam, finds himself naked. This is another place that we're going to have to clarify some things that we, generally speaking, as modern Americans are indeed, we are left with an inability to understand the significance of nakedness. Wine mocking Noah is manifest in Noah lying naked in his tent. The way modern people, including modern Christians, unfortunately think is, well, if no one got hurt, and if Noah willfully chose to do this, if it was of his own volition, then what's the problem? I mean, Noah passes out in his tent because he's drunk. Okay, move on. No big deal. Well, that's not the way sin is defined. And that's not the way that sin works in our lives. See, the fact that sin actually is violation of God's law and that God has so designed the world that there will be consequences for sin, that we need to understand the significance of Noah being naked because he passed out drunk in his tent. When one is literally naked before another person, and by that I don't mean sort of infant children or children who are low. We're not talking about sort of right in whatever version Noah was taking a shower and someone sort of accidentally and inappropriately sort of stumbles in and goes, "Oh, I'm sorry." Like that's not the situation that is going on here. Noah first uncovers himself, and he does so in his drunken stupor. And nakedness, we already are able to know from Genesis chapter 3, is the consequence of sinfully seeking a knowledge of good and evil that is only fit for God to have. So that Adam and Eve, they know they are naked because they are ashamed, they are guilty of their sin against God. And so, in that sense, physical nakedness being displayed before other people, in one sense, is only done by those who do not care about their guilt of sin before God. Now, that makes no sense to modern Americans today, does it? I mean, in our society, we have, like in one sense, crafted the ability and even industries to figure out how can you technically be clothed but practically be naked. If you are a Christian woman and you have Christian daughters and you are thinking, how can I dress in such a way that I do not look like a harlot? Like you have an actual enterprise when it comes to shopping. We are a transgressive society. Therefore, we are actively, we are entertaining, we are developing how it is that we can be transgressive. And one of the ways that this is manifest in the fact that we actually are skilled at somehow uncovering ourselves in the presence of others. What this illustrates is the depth of our seared conscience to acknowledge the guilt of our sin before God. I would quickly want to give some definitions that I imagine you may reject these, but I'm just going to lay them on you and say, prove differently from Scripture. I am going to say that when you consider the way nakedness functions in Scripture from Genesis 3 moving forward, you are going to see that nakedness is only acceptable when a husband and wife are together in the one flesh covenant relationship of marriage. If anybody else is trying to parade or uncover themselves in front of another person, then what you have is a transgressive activity. And therefore, we could say churches, families, societies, cultures that are actually seeking to honor God and love their neighbor, they think in terms of covering, not in terms of revealing. Thus, the category that is described here about Noah, passed out drunk, uncovered in his tent, is indicating sin. This is sin. This is violation of God's law. This is living in rebellion against God. This is not just not good. This is wrong in God's eyes. So I would quickly want this category of nakedness to maybe be not what you think it is. Nakedness is not just choosing to be relatively unclothed or completely unclothed before people. Nakedness is not caring about your guilt before God. There is ingrained into us a almost right understanding that if for some reason you did find someone seeing you unclothed and the intent of their gaze upon you was sinful, you would immediately know this is wrong. That's why I would say if you think that our culture is in one sense an acceptable God for the way in which that we should think about the human body, about how we understand relating to one another publicly, physically in these bodies, and the way we dress or do not dress, then you are lost at sea. Women in our society learn how to dress in such a way that they are only developing a transgressive ability to live in violation of God's law, and it is either searing their conscience or illustrating a seared conscience in that conduct. Men, the same thing is true for you. It's just not as, in one sense, developed. Romans chapter 1, verses 18 to 32, in one sense, takes us down the road to sort of moral rock bottom among people. How do you know that you've hit rock bottom morally, either as an individual or as a group of individuals? Well, it's not homosexuality. Now, that is a stop along the way, but that's not rock bottom. Rock bottom is when you call evil good and good evil. And if we think that nakedness, presenting our bodies before someone else who is not our spouse, if we think that there is any place for that and you call that good, I need to tell you, you've hit rock bottom. Because it's actually evil. The place where any one of us is to be naked before another person is when you marry and you become one flesh with that person. Now, quickly, this enables us to understand categorically what is pornography. Whatever degree or grade you want to give to it, all of it is transgressive. All of it. Voyeurism of any kind is transgressive. Let me just also say the spirit that motivates some people in what they choose to wear when they do step out into public is transgressive. If your intent is to reveal, in one sense, your body to another, then you need to understand that fits into this category of being uncovered, where you do not care about your guilt before God. All right, so this is the sin of Noah. Verse 21, few phrases. We are able to see that Noah gets drunk and uncovers himself inside of his tent. All right. Just to summarize, that's not what you think it is. It's evil. It's sin. It's transgressive. This is Noah's sin. So now when we see the responses of his sons, it might help us to interpret their actions appropriately and then see how God's word judges them. Ham is the first, verse 22. Then Ham, again, with this same sort of new definition, the father of Canaan, saw the nakedness of his father and told his two brothers outside. We are able to know from the text that what Ham chooses to do is sinful for the following reasons. Number one, we are able to see that when Ham comes and sees his father naked in his tent, the very seeing is sinful. Now, this could be a little bit lost on us because we would read this and maybe imagine it to be like you accidentally went into the bathroom when your dad was in there. Like that's not what is being described here. When Ham goes in and he sees the nakedness of his father, there is a transgressive exercise in Ham's heart in the seeing the nakedness of his father. You may want to just go over to Habakkuk chapter 2 and be able to see the way in which this is used to describe sin that brings God's judgment in Habakkuk's prophecy. In chapter 2, verse 15, we read, "Woe to you who pour out your wrath and make them drunk in order to gaze at their nakedness. You will have your fill of shame instead of glory. Drink yourself and show your uncircumcision." See, there's an association, and is it not a timeless association of what do people generally have in mind when they do go out to drink and get drunk? It's this kind of intent in Ham's heart that is a part of his seeing. When we see the son of Adam who murders his brother, Cain, we're like, how? How? Here's the answer: sin. When we see this son, Ham, look at his father and his nakedness in this way, we how? And we want to answer questions like, what kind of upbringing did they have? Like, I mean, some of y'all may ask crazy questions like, what kind of food were they eating? Maybe they weren't getting enough light or something. Like, no, those are not the answers. Sin is the answer. The reason Cain murdered Abel is because he sinned in his heart against God and against his brother. That's what sinners do. The reason that Ham could come in and see his father's nakedness in this sinful manner is because he's a sinner. This is what sinners do. So one, the seeing in and of itself is sinful. Difficult though that may be for us to be able to recognize, this is what is being described when Moses writes that Ham saw the nakedness of his father. Now, the second thing that teaches us that indeed what Ham did was sinful is, what does he do in response? Does he, like Adam and Eve after their transgression, seek to cover themselves? Does he, like God, who covers Adam and Eve adequately with the animal skins, does he do that? Does he seek to respond to the guilt of sin by seeking to cover sin? No. He goes and tells his two brothers. See, this is indicating Ham's heart. Ham was not wanting to respond to sin in the appropriate way in relationship to God. And so by going to tell his brothers, we are able to see what is true of Ham's heart. And then when we see his other brother's response, we are able to see this is the right response to sin before God. And so now let's look at the other two brothers. Shem and Japheth, verse 23, they took the garment and they laid it upon both of their shoulders, and they walked backward and covered the nakedness of their father, and their faces were turned backward so that they did not see their father's nakedness. We get the longest explanation in this entire narrative event of these two brothers covering their passed out drunk father naked in his tent. This is indicating for us the attention that they give to be able to cover their father's nakedness. This is the right response. This is going to, in one sense, show us is now the peoples who will be spread over the entire earth. They will all derive their origin from one of these three brothers. You're able to see what is the spirit of the descendants of Ham. What is, in one sense, the heartbeat of Canaan? It is sin and no shame of sin before God. It is open and increased transgression against God. And then you will see that there's going to be another group of people who will be marked by dealing with sin before God, according to God's demands. They will have to give attention to what God requires, and they will give attention to not doing that which God declares to be sin. And so these two brothers are the ones who indicate that for us. And so it is Shem and Japheth that we are able to see, verse 24, when Noah awoke from his wine, which does enable us to say, there was alcohol in this grape juice. This clearly was not grape juice. Noah awakes from having passed out, from drinking too much wine. And then verse 24 tells us, which also illustrates that there was a transgressive element to Ham's action. Noah, verse 24, knew what his youngest son had done to him. Now, we can only speculate, and we should be careful about any and all speculation from the text, but it seems that Noah has knowledge of the act of his son, the deed of Ham, and knows that it is transgressive. So in verse 25, we read that Noah, now prophetically, just as we will see in chapter 49 of Israel's sons, he now pronounces cursing and blessing on his son. Verse 25, Noah curses Canaan and says he will be servant of servants, and he shall be to his brothers. And then verses 26 and 27, we see that Shem is blessed and Japheth is blessed, such that the God of Shem is to be blessed and Japheth will be enlarged. Japheth will dwell in the tents of Shem, but Canaan will be his servants. See, now there is an ordering of these brothers as well as their descendants on the basis of their response to sin. This, in one sense, now tells you Genesis is going to unfold for us what God continues to do in his plan of redemption as well as his judgment of his enemies. The world is going to work such that the Hams of this world, the societies like Canaan, Sodoms, Gomorrahs, they are going to operate in this Ham-like way in rebellion against God in increasingly transgressive ways that only escalate in their high-handed rebellion against God. Those will be one order of civilization of peoples in this world. But guess what is going to be true of them? They will be made servants of Shem. See, God here in this particular text is telling us what God is doing in the redemptive covenant promises that are accomplished in Jesus Christ is those who are like Ham, they will be brought into submission, into servanthood. They will be made to bow under the one ultimately who is that great seed of the woman who will crush the serpent's head, who will come from one of the tribes of the people who come from Shem. See, God's work in this world, we will see, is reversing the present order of things. And this is going to be such that the Canaans will be the servants to Shem. If you're in that sense wondering, just as we, though mistakenly, though helpfully, read from 1 Corinthians 15, what did we read there that God the Father is doing in relationship of creation to the Son? He's putting all things under his Son. Here is right in the beginning, the prophecy of what God is doing in all of the nations right now. All of the nations will come from these three sons, but only one of those nations will rule over all of the other nations, and it will be the one who has the God of Shem as their God. And so there is a reversal of the present order of the sinful world that God is going to bring when it comes to the blessing that is given to Shem for the way in which he responded to the sin of his father. He covered his nakedness. The same for Japheth, but the one Ham, the son who sinned against his father and did not cover his sin, he is cursed. And Canaan and all those who have, in that sense, the heart of Ham, they will be made servants of those who have the God of Shem to be their God. This is the future division of the world. What do you think we're going to find next in Genesis? Genesis 10 is now going to give to us, in one sense, sort of a perfect breakdown of all of the nations as they come from these three sons of Noah. These sons of Noah, indeed, they will advance God's redemptive purposes in the world, but they advance it in such a way that we now know how is redemption going to work. It is going to work in such a way that the salvation that God brings is going to come through the judgment of sin. These sons of Noah frame and shape for us what we are going to see. God's redemptive promises are going to fulfill. So, you may have questions. Come and ask me. I can't promise to answer all of the questions. I still have some questions that are unanswered, but do the best that I can to answer any questions. Parents, if you would maybe clarify some points for your children so that they have a right understanding of these things. But Tim is going to close us in a song and benediction.